Today, it seems that the West is seeing Iran's weakness. And during the first 2 weeks of the war against Iran, it's easy to overlook this, especially with so many events happening elsewhere and with seemingly little happening in this area itself. For now, there are four main metrics that dominate media discussions about the war. First, the literal physical safety of the Iranian government. And in fact, the results here are mixed. Second, the gradually decreasing inventory of weapons of the United States at a time when geopolitical competition is intensifying. You should remember that there are other rival countries that are clearly more important in the broader strategic picture. So there are also many serious questions here. Third, Iran's own stockpile of ballistic missiles and drones, and whether the United States can effectively destroy the places where these are launched and manufactured. There has been some progress on the part of America, but it is still far from being able to say that the situation is safe. And fourth, the flow of oil coming from the Gulf countries and the price paid by Americans and the rest of the world because of this. And in fact, the situation is somewhat alarming. However, there is a fifth measure that is just as important as those mentioned, but only a few pay attention to it, and this is the flow of oil coming directly from Iran. And this is where the first truly noticeable attack since the first day of the war connects. That includes the possibility of eliminating the Ayatollah himself. In addition, this could also open up the possibility that for the first time, American soldiers might set foot on Iranian soil. If that's not enough reason to talk about it, I don't know what else should be. So in this video, we will analyze the strategic situation concerning Iran's most important island. But before we start, if you're new to our channel, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. Let's take a moment to review what's happening. Right now, it seems like Iran is trying to gain benefits from both sides. On one hand, the Islamic Republic is threatening to attack oil tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz, a very important passage where about 20% of the world's oil passes through. Because of this, oil prices suddenly spiked, which of course caused anger among consumers in the United States and disappointment from its allies in other countries. But if you remember, I already explained before that this situation is like a game of mutually assured destruction. In simple terms, Iran also can't afford to lose the Strait of Hormuz because most of their own oil exports pass through there. In fact, only 10% of Iran's oil can be exported without passing through the strait, using a pipeline built to an export terminal. A system intentionally made so there would be an alternative in case there are problems in Hormuz. But if you think about it, 10% is really very small. And if you look at the similar alternative of the United Arab Emirates, you'll see that the problem is the same. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, almost everyone will be affected. Just like with the use of nuclear weapons, there are always countries looking for ways to get around this problem of mutually assured destruction. In the case of Iran, their solution was a kind of careful coordination with tankers from India to allow them to pass through without any obstacles. There are also talks about allowing tankers to trade using the Chinese yuan, which seems to be a way to weaken the domination of the petrodollar in global oil trade. If it seems like this is following the current division of geopolitical blocs in the world, your suspicion is correct. That's exactly what's happening. However, up to now, the success of this plan is still limited. Even though some ships have been allowed to pass, there's still a risk that Iran's local military might not follow orders and might still decide to open fire. And for tanker captains who want to stay alive, this possibility alone is enough to make them avoid the danger. It's very important for Iran to resolve this problem. Oil exports make up almost 30% of the government's revenue and 15% of the country's entire economy. And if you look at it from the government's perspective, it's hard to keep paying the security forces if no money is coming in, unless they decide to print money, which is a very bad idea for other reasons. On the side of the civilians, losing 15% of the economy overnight will have a domino effect on almost every sector. And when you combine citizens who have lost their jobs and soldiers who are not getting paid, that is a very dangerous situation for any government. Honestly, the media doesn't really pay much attention to this problem. It's easier to show dramatic images of American military forces in the region on television. But a slowly worsening economic crisis inside Iran is not as noticeable on camera. And in the history of war, it's often the quiet and seemingly boring problems, not the loud explosions, that truly bring nations down. Now, there really is a big question. Will the United States actually permit Iran to do this? It was only about a week ago when Israel bombed Iran's oil infrastructure, which immediately caused a significant increase in oil prices worldwide. There was reportedly a strong reaction inside the White House, and it's likely that there will be an angry phone call from Washington heading to Israel with a threat that military aid might be reduced, or that Israel could even be abandoned in the middle of the war. Because of this, Israel temporarily stopped this kind of operation, and eventually the price of oil slightly went down again. And because of this, a theory is really starting to resurface. The White House might be so worried about the rising oil prices that they could possibly allow Iran to manipulate the system in a limited way. In this situation, some oil supply from the Gulf would still remain in the global market, which could help, even just a little, to lower gasoline prices. Or actually, that might be the easiest option compared to other ways to solve the problem. If you really want to stop Iran's tankers, you need to shoot at them or board them if the tankers themselves are your target. But wait, let's get back to that later. On the political side, it's possible that the oil inside a tanker is owned by a foreign company, for example, in China. If the US forces shoot at or seize these kinds of tankers, the problem could escalate and spread all the way to the capitals of different countries. And in my personal view, I would prefer that this crisis remains a simple global crisis rather than escalating into a third world war. From a military standpoint, the United States is capable of capturing 1 or 2 tankers. We have seen this before in operations near Venezuela, where the US Navy even chased tankers far from the coast of Venezuela. But the problem is there are too many ships coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. If America really wants to monitor and stop all of this, they will need to send a lot of patrol vessels to the region to conduct continuous surveillance. And no matter how strong the United States military is, they are not immune to the same logistical problems that other countries face. Organizing an enforcement operation of this scale would be a huge challenge. I have no doubt that it would be easier to just torpedo every tanker that leaves. But I'm sure that if that happens, the United States Congress would immediately take action and would not simply allow such a move. And in addition to that, that's a kind of action that almost directly invites a third world war, and it's clear that that's something's better avoided. However, it would be strange if the United States would just allow Iran to sell oil as if there were no war going on. In fact, one of the goals of this war is to take advantage of the long-standing desire of many Iranian citizens to oppose their government. And one of the most effective ways to make that happen is to cut off the government's income from oil. Besides that, we know that the American president wants to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. In the end, Iran will also open it once their government decides that they will lose if they keep insisting on this. But if you ask me, the situation where Iran gets all the benefits with almost no sacrifice in return is the opposite of a losing policy. In other words, if you want to force Iran to reopen the Strait, you need to make it more painful for them to keep it closed. Now, everything you've heard so far seems like just the beginning of a move by the United States that almost no one saw coming. Let's move on to Kharg Island. If we're talking about a target for retaliation, Kharg Island is probably Iran's most important facility. This island really has immense practical and economic value. In fact, a large part of Iran's livelihood and economy depends on oil exports from Kharg Island. And in a way, it also serves as a bargaining lever. The United States can show Iran that if they can disrupt the flow of oil to the world, America can also block Iran's own exports. But this kind of move is really very dangerous because an immediate question arises. How would the Soviets take this? After all, everyone has long known that this could happen. The last part of what I read are paraphrased comments from a strategic meeting during Jimmy Carter's time, made in response to the Iran hostage crisis. The point here is simple. This is a very clear move that Iran should have long expected. And they probably do expect it, but there is little they can do to stop the United States if it decides to do this. Here is Iran's problem. The country is very rich in oil, almost more than it needs. But as if by a twist of fate, Iran was not given many deep coastlines for large tankers. And we know that ultra-large crude carriers are really truly massive. They need deep waters close to the shore, otherwise they might run aground. And this is where Kharg Island comes in as the solution. The waters around here are deep enough for large oil tankers to come close and load oil. As long as Iran sends oil to the island, it will be easy for oil tankers to get it from there. This is similar to what they do at other oil terminals around the world. Iran has now solved the problem by using large pipelines that come directly from the mainland, pass under the sea, and reach all the way to the island. At first glance, this seems like a perfect solution, but there's one big problem. It's on an island. This isn't the easiest place to send supplies. And if the operations in this location are damaged or disrupted, almost 70% of Iran's oil exports could immediately disappear from the market. And if we go back to the point, if the United States manages to stop the oil tankers related to Iran, they don't need to attack the tankers themselves. They also don't need to guard the entire coastline of Iran or destroy a lot of port infrastructure. Instead, there's only one place they need to control or influence, and that's Kharg Island. This isn't a new idea either. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq tried to attack the island. Their goal was to force Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, because they would no longer have any oil to export from the West. However, at present this time, the United States used a different tactic. You should remember that any serious damage to Iran's oil infrastructure could cause a significant increase in global oil prices, something the President of America desperately wants to avoid. From a strategic perspective, destroying the actual oil facilities also has a unique effect. If Iran cannot export oil during the war but can do so once the war is over, the lost income can be considered a cost of the war. However, if they still cannot export even after the war is over, that is no longer a cost of the war, but simply the new normal reality. And if that's the case, it will no longer influence Iran's decisions in negotiations. This is also the logic behind why some European countries are hesitant to seize Russia's frozen funds in the banks of allied countries. While the money is frozen, it provides leverage in negotiations with Russia. In the case of Kharg Island, it seems that the United States targeted the runway and several bunkers on the edge of the island's embankment. These are military assets that help Iran defend the island. But there's one thing that's noticeable. The attacks did not hit the oil storage tanks in the south of the island, nor the offshore loading facilities where oil is loaded onto tankers. In other words, it's similar to the situation in Venezuela, where the United States tries to be aggressive militarily, but doesn't really disrupt the global oil trade. It's a bit ironic if you think about it, but overall, it's like the United States is just softening the defenses of Kharg Island while trying to keep its oil infrastructure intact. And in other words, it seems like the island is being prepared for a possible operation or attack in the future. At the same time, there are reports that the USS Tripoli is heading from the Philippine Sea to the Gulf region, along with its Marine Expeditionary Unit. However, we also need to be careful in connecting these two events because some might ask, if the island is really going to be attacked, why use an amphibious assault ship when forces can be directly sent from the west by airplane? But even so, it's easy to see how the United States could prepare for a possible operation. Forces could land on the island, destroy the facilities needed for loading oil onto tankers, and then immediately leave. At the same time, they would carefully avoid destroying facilities that would take a long time to replace, so as not to cause bigger problems for the global oil supply. It's also not practical to stay for a long time. The island has around 8,000 residents, and it's clear that the United States is already tired of counterinsurgency wars that last for many years. And aside from that, the US Navy doesn't have complete control over the Persian Gulf, so there's a possibility that problems could arise from the sea. However, because of this island, operations can be carried out smoothly without worrying about reinforcements, as long as the entry and exit of forces are quick. Then, to keep the operation closed while there are still problems in the Strait, the United States can simply threaten to return if necessary, especially if Iran struggles to resupply defenses to the island with destroyed military infrastructure. Now, we need to finish. On the battlefield, decisions often follow a game tree, a series of steps that both sides can clearly see. And this is one of those situations. Both Tehran and Washington understand the value of Kharg Isle and the strategic opportunity that has opened up for the United States. Instead of continuing down a path that would hurt both sides, Iran could choose to temporarily stop trying to get its own oil through the Strait and temporarily halt the loading of tankers at Kharg Island. If that happens, the United States would have no reason to take the next step. And that's the reason why the title of the video is about Iran's weakness that the United States could attack, and not that the United States will attack this weakness. Those are two different statements. However, everyone also knows that the United States can weaken the island's defenses, and that has already happened now. However, this did not immediately force Iran to negotiate in order to avoid the next stage of escalation. Although everyone knows closing the Strait of Hormuz would hurt both sides, we're still in a crisis. Currently, negotiations appear stalled, and it's unclear how much worse things may get. However, we will probably be back tomorrow to explain whatever new developments have happened. Now, if you want to understand this war better, you can check out my playlist about the conflict in the Middle East. And if you enjoyed these videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And we'll see each other again in our next video.